They found his body after weeks, not on a throne but in a cold, forgotten cell, with his skin fused to his bone, lips cracked, eyes still open, staring at nothing. No guards, no light, no food, just damp stone, and the echo of a crown that no longer mattered. He died alone, the same king that once ruled England, wore golden robes like armor, spoke like he'd been kissed by heaven, and walked like the world owed him obedience. What happened? Was he mad? Or just a boy king surrounded by wolves and waiting for him to blink? And when he did, they took everything. This is the fall of Richard II, the monarch who believed he was untouchable, but died starving in darkness, while the throne moved on without him. And it all began with a coronation at just 10 years old. Richard was just 10 years old when they put the crown on his head. 10. Most boys that age are climbing trees or chasing dogs through muddy fields. But Richard? He was lifted above the crowd, wrapped in silk, and called Your Majesty. The Archbishop anointed him with holy oil. Trumpets blasted across Westminster. Courtiers bowed so low their foreheads kissed stone. But behind the velvet and gold, England was rotting. The Black Death had emptied villages. Fields lay fallow, cattle starved. Famine clung to the land like a fog no one could shake. And then there was the war. That endless war. France, blood, money. England was bleeding silver into foreign soil and getting nothing back but more graves. Richard had no idea. At 10, he still believed in stories, that God picked kings, that grown men told the truth, that the world would wait for him to grow, but it wouldn't. Every smile in court came with a knife tucked beneath it. Every advisor bowed and then whispered behind closed doors. The boy was king, but the adults ruled the kingdom. His uncle John of Gaunt, the iron-willed Duke of Lancaster, moved pieces on the board like a man who'd already buried better kings. Others circled, barons, bishops, merchants, spies, each one tugging strings, each one thinking, we can shape him. And maybe they did, because Richard didn't fight back. He listened, he nodded, he let them lead. But he was watching, and what he learned in those early years would shape the madness to come. Summer, 1381. London is burning, shops smashed, manors looted, nobles dragged into the streets. The peasants, the very people who feed England, have risen. And they're not begging, they're demanding years of starvation, unpaid wages, tax after tax, to fund a war they'll never see. And now, 20,000 of them march into the heart of the kingdom, armed with pitchforks, axes, and pure, unfiltered rage. The king's advisors panic, his bodyguards flee, the government gone, and standing alone, barely a teenager, is Richard, 14. He rides straight into the teeth of the mob, not armored, not hidden, not flanked by knights, just him. The crowd parts, like a sea of heat and hatred, one wrong word, and his skull's on a spike. But Richard doesn't flinch. He raises his hand, and then he speaks. I am your king. I will be your leader. Follow me. And slowly, unbelievably, the anger begins to cool. The riot doesn't end, but it listens. And in that moment, England doesn't see a boy. They see a king, or at least a boy pretending to be one. Was it courage? Was it luck? Or was it the first glimpse of something else? A performer, behind the mask of royalty. Someone who saw power not as duty, but theatre, because the moment passed, and Richard ordered the rebel leaders killed. Thousands hunted down, executed, branded traitors. One moment, he was the voice of peace. The next, the hammer of vengeance. After the revolt, Richard returned to a palace filled with praise. But none of it was real. The lords toasted him, the bishops smiled. His uncle, John of Gaunt, clapped his shoulder, like a proud father. But when the doors closed, they ruled without him. John of Gaunt, the Iron Duke, believed Richard was a placeholder, a royal shell. Gaunt whispered policies, appointed ministers, pulled taxes like strings on a marionette. And the rest of the court? They played along. They saw a boy king with a gift for speeches and figured that's all he was. A mask. A crown with no blade behind it. But inside Richard, a fire was starting. He remembered that crowd in London. How they listened. How one sentence from his mouth stopped a revolution. And he thought, if I can calm a mob, I can control anything. He stopped being the boy king and started studying power like a craft, how to flatter, how to punish, how to smile with your lips and slit throats with your laws. Every council meeting became a performance, every nod, every silence, measured. He wasn't their puppet anymore, he was watching, learning, waiting. What kind of man do you become when your whole life is just performance? When every adult in your life thinks they're running you, while you quietly build your own crown, in your mind. Richard was no longer a child, and soon, England would see what that really meant. Richard turned 20, and everything changed. He stopped asking, stopped waiting, and started ruling. One by one, the old hands around the throne, the mentors, the advisors, the puppeteers, began to vanish. Some were retired, some quietly exiled, others weren't so lucky. He called it reform. But to the court, it felt more like a purge. In their place, Richard raised new men, loyalists, favourites, friends, not the weathered, seasoned barons of old, but younger men, artists, flatterers, courtiers with soft hands and silver tongues. They praised his taste, his wisdom, his divine right to rule, without parliament, without interference. And Richard listened. He built an inner circle that didn't challenge him. They told him what he wanted to hear, that he was chosen, that his enemies were traitors, that opposition was sin. And Richard believed them. He began dressing like a Byzantine emperor, robes of purple and gold, jeweled shoes, silk cushions beneath his throne. He stopped being the king and started performing it. Every gesture rehearsed, every speech a sermon, every moment crafted to remind everyone, I am not just a ruler, I am the realm itself. But here's the thing. When you build a kingdom on obedience, when no one dares to say no, what happens the moment things go wrong? What happens when the world stops clapping? Because Richard was about to learn that loyalty bought with fear is loyalty that runs when the fire starts. By now, Richard didn't just have a court. He had a stage, velvet curtains, incense drifting through the halls, musicians playing as if the air itself bowed to him, and beside him, always, his favourites. Not warriors, not seasoned lords, but poets, designers, young men who dressed like royalty and spoke like scripture. They read him sonnets, praised his cheekbones, compared him to Alexander, Solomon, even Christ. To Richard they were brilliance incarnate, refined, loyal, divine. To the old nobility, they were snakes in perfume, arrogant, soft, unworthy, men who'd never held a sword or walked a battlefield, but who now whispered in the king's ear, while seasoned generals were left cooling their heels in the hallway. The nobles sneered. They saw a king who threw feasts during famines, who built gilded halls while soldiers went unpaid, who spent more time posing for decorations than planning for war. And yet, Richard didn't care. He liked the resentment. He fed on it. Every time a baron's lip curled, every time a lord clenched his fists in silence, Richard sat taller, smiled wider. Because deep down, he remembered all the years they treated him like a boy. And now? They bowed to him, while his favourites danced. But beneath the silks and poetry, a storm was building. One whisper at a time, one bitter look, one insult too many. And Richard? He couldn't see it, or worse, he refused to believe it mattered. While Richard filled his halls with laughter, silk and praise, one man stood in the shadows, watching. Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, royal blood, cousin to the king. But nothing like him. Henry didn't speak often, didn't dress like royalty, didn't flirt with poets. He didn't challenge Richard outright, not yet. He just watched. At council meetings he said little, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched Richard remove the old guard, watched the throne turn into a theatre, watched favourites rise, then fall, then vanish without warning. He watched and remembered, because Henry knew something Richard had forgotten. The nobility never forgets a slight, and they never forgive weakness that wears gold. Where Richard saw worship, Henry saw rot. Where Richard surrounded himself with beauty, Henry built alliances, quietly, patiently. He made himself useful, diplomatic, humble. He said what needed to be said, and never a word more. To Richard, Henry was just another loyal cousin, unthreatening, calm, obedient. But in reality, he was a blade being sharpened in silence, and when the kingdom finally cracked, Henry Bolingbroke would be ready. At first it was just language. Richard stopped calling himself king. He called himself God's deputy, then the vicar of Christ on earth. And finally, he dropped the metaphors altogether. He said God had placed him on the throne, not just to rule, but to embody divine will, not a servant of heaven, but its voice, its hands, its wrath. His coronation rituals changed. Every audience with him became a ceremony. You didn't approach Richard casually. You approached like entering a church. He designed the court like a cathedral. Incense, candles, choirs echoing Latin hymns while he passed. No one was allowed to look him directly in the eyes, not unless invited. Even his robes changed, long flowing gowns embroidered with angels, suns, and divine symbols, as if every thread was stitched by prophets. Some said it was harmless, just vanity, pageantry, but others saw something else. Richard didn't just want control, he wanted worship. He didn't just think he was right. He believed opposition was heresy. And if you truly thought God spoke through you, what wouldn't you do to someone who defied you? This wasn't politics anymore, this was prophecy. And Richard, now fully convinced of his divine identity, was preparing to cleanse his kingdom of unbelievers. By the late 1390s, Richard had stopped pretending he was part of a government. He didn't ask for consent. He didn't seek approval. He gave commands. And worse, he gave them in silence. He began holding private councils, late at night, curtains drawn. No records kept. No one knew who was advising him. No one knew what laws were being passed. And sometimes, not even what they had agreed to. He started handing his nobles documents to sign. Blank. No content. No terms. Just a wax seal and the king's demand. Sign. They did. Because the penalty for refusal could be land seizure, exile, or a quiet disappearance no one dared speak of. Lords whispered behind closed doors. Bishops clutched their rings a little tighter. What was in those documents? New taxes, land grabs, death warrants? No one knew. And that was the point. Fear did what loyalty never could. Richard wanted obedience not through respect, but through confusion. Make the powerful unsure, make them guess, make them scared. Some began calling him paranoid. Others said he was brilliant. But all agreed on one thing. This wasn't the boy king anymore. This was something else, something dangerous. And while all these were happening, Henry Bolingbroke was still watching in the shadows. The whispers began. At first, soft, like a breeze through castle corridors. Then it became louder. Critics vanished. Some quietly disappeared. Others were accused of treason, exiled, to worse. Richard stopped listening, stopped trusting. He spoke only to those who repeated his words back like prayers. His court shrank. His inner circle became a hall of echoes, each voice that questioned him who was silenced. Because to Richard, if he was truly God's chosen, how could anyone still doubt him? Power, once aflame, became a prison. The golden robes weighed heavy. The crown felt like a noose. His mind, once sharp and curious, now trapped in paranoia. Would you trust anyone? If you believed you were chosen by God, and they still dared to question you? Richard was alone, more alone than ever before. And the kingdom, it was cracking beneath him. Richard built palaces like a man trying to catch the sun. The Sheen Palace was shining with gold leaf, halls dripping with silver candlesticks. Every stone screamed wealth, every room a theatre of power. But the kingdom's coffers were empty. Wars had drained the treasury, tax collectors returned with hollow purses. Still, Richard threw coin like water. To him, opulence was power made visible. If the people saw him dressed like a god, seated on a throne of diamonds, maybe they'd believe in him again. But power isn't a costume, it's a force. And no amount of silk could fill the cracks beneath his feet. The nobles whispered again. He wastes our money. He's blind to the real threats. And Richard, he heard none of it. He was too busy polishing gold, lighting candles in empty halls, and speaking to shadows, in chambers lined with mirrors. Because paranoia had crept deeper than anyone could see. The more he built, the more he feared. And the more he feared, the less he trusted. The gold ran out. But Richard's demands only grew louder. He imposed taxes like a hammer, crushing peasants, merchants, and nobles alike. The people grumbled in market squares, whispered in taverns, and sometimes outright refused to pay. But Richard didn't care. To him, loyalty meant obedience, no matter the cost. And the nobles, they didn't just grumble, they plotted. The most dangerous moment came with John of Gaunt's death. Richard didn't mourn. Instead, he reached out and seized his uncle's vast lands and wealth, including the inheritance of Henry Bolingbroke. It was a theft no one could ignore. Henry wasn't just a cousin anymore, he was a man robbed, and a man with nothing left to lose. Henry Bolingbroke didn't speak much, but when he did, the world listened. His uncle's death wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a line drawn in the sand. When Richard took John of Gaunt's lands, Henry knew the game was over. He left his comfortable exile in France, not as a supplicant begging for mercy, but as a man declaring war. England held its breath. Whispers spread like wildfire. He'll come back not just for his land, but for the throne itself. Henry wasn't the boy who watched from the sidelines anymore. He was the viper uncoiling and ready to strike. And Richard, he was about to find out how thin the line was between a king and a prisoner. Richard was far away, across the sea in Ireland, chasing shadows and rebellions of his own. Meanwhile, England waited. Then one day, a ship appeared on the horizon. Henry Bolingbroke had returned, but he wasn't alone. Nobles who once whispered in shadows now walked openly at his side. They didn't come for a friendly reunion. They came with fire in their hearts, swords in their hands, and a single purpose: to take back what Richard had stolen. England's cracks weren't just deep, they were opening like wounds. And Richard, he was dangerously unaware. As Bolingbroke marched across England, Richard's world started to crumble. Allies, once loyal, once proud, vanished like ghosts. Some fled, some switched sides, others were silenced before they could choose. When Richard finally returned from Ireland, it wasn't to cheers, it was to betrayal. Faces he trusted turned cold. Voices that promised loyalty whispered treason. The throne he'd fought for became a gilded cage, a prison forged from gold and broken promises. The crown weighed heavy. And Richard, he was trapped. Then a day came like a shadow falling over a dying sun. Richard stood, alone, in the cold stone hall. Before him was brought a document. The signature on this page would erase a kingdom and lock him up from the world forever, end his reign. But he did not scream, he did not beg. He signed it, calmly, silently, because even as the ink dried, he still believed he was right, still believed the crown was his by divine right, still believed he was the king, no matter what the world said. What kind of man reads the words that erase his kingdom and still believes he's right? He who once wore golden robes, who commanded silence and reverence, now sat alone in a cell of cold stone. No silk to soften his skin, no flickering candles, no courtly voices, only darkness. No guards paced outside, no servants brought food, No messenger answered his calls. Richard was a king without kingdom, a man stripped of power and dignity. The silence pressed in, heavier than any crown. He was forgotten, not just by the nobles who plotted his downfall, but by the world itself. In that cold cage, the king became nothing more than a shadow. After many weeks had passed, they found him lying dead and lifeless on the ground, skin clinging to bone, eyes wide open in the dark. No guards, no food, no light. Some say starvation. Others whisper poison. Was it murder or madness? But maybe it wasn't the blade or the cup. Maybe it was the silence itself, the weight of being forgotten, the slow death of a king trapped not just in stone, but inside his own mind. Richard II, the mad king who died starving in darkness. But Richard's death didn't end the story. It began a new one. Centuries later, Shakespeare gave him life again. A king trapped by fate. A man torn between pride and despair. Beautiful in his downfall. On stage he was tragic, a crown too heavy to bear. But the chroniclers of his time, they wrote of cruelty, madness, and instability. A king broken not just by circumstance, but by his own unraveling mind. Two portraits of a man, one a martyr, the other a madman. Which one do you believe? Richard's death passed almost unnoticed. No grand funeral, no chants or prayers echoing through cathedrals. Just dirt, cold earth. He was buried without ceremony, without tears. A king laid to rest, not in the halls of power, but in the shadows of history. Forgotten by the kingdom he once ruled, lost to time and silence. His crown shattered. His story fading into dust. Henry IV took the throne. But the crown felt heavy from the start. Uprisings shook his reign. Rebellions flared. Whispers of guilt and fear followed his steps. Some said England itself mourned Richard. Years later, Richard's bones were moved, reburied with a quiet ceremony. A late apology, or perhaps a recognition that even forgotten kings leave marks. History may erase a man's power, but it can never erase his story. Now I want to hear from you. Was Richard II truly insane, or just too human for the crown he wore? If you strip a man of power, of dignity, of voice, does he go mad? Or does the world just call him mad because they're afraid to admit what they did? Hit the comments and tell me what you think. If you found this story interesting, hit that subscribe button for more contents like this. Stick around for the next one.